we do have quite a busy agenda looking at several angles on economics, so we will do our best to keep to time. We're also going to be running an economics themed whiteboard, which you will be invited to contribute your thoughts to. For those of you who've been on one of our events before, you'll be familiar with that. Tim will be putting a link in the chat, which when you click on, it will take you to a whiteboard where you can, as things progress, you can put all your thoughts in there about the theme of economics. Okay, so with this brief introduction, my job is really to help us get into the headspace of economics, particularly in relation to Cumbria. So I'm just going to try and set the scene a little bit. But I just wanted to start with a reminder of why we're here. I think it's always useful to remind ourselves of the challenge that we're facing and to focus our minds on that. So this is a quote from the UN IPCC's recent instalment of its 6th assessment report. This came out just a few weeks ago, and it's a really, really stark message calling for immediate action to make deep emissions reductions across all sectors. And just as a reminder, I'm sure you're probably mostly aware that we're currently at around 1.2 degrees of warming. So every fraction of a degree counts. So we're actually in a bit of a mess. We have both climate and ecological emergencies caused by the ever-growing consumption of Earth's resources, all in pursuit of improving a standard of living. But there is
Karen, if you were planning to share screen, we're not actually seeing your screen as yet. So,
oh, okay, sorry about that. I will have another go. Can you see that?
Yes, we can now. Thank you. It's in. There we go. Slide share. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let me just move this. So I was about to say there is increasing recognition that we live on a finite planet and that we need to separate growth from trashing the planet, and that it may be possible to improve people's lives in a no-growth economy, and increasing attention being paid to climate economics. Climate economics has often been seen as as focusing on the cost of damage arising from climate change. So at a global level, there have been various reports setting out the economic and social cost of global heating, and it's often the obvious stuff. So when we look in Cumbria, it's really easy to see the figures for the damage that Storm Desmond created back in 2015. To the insurers, that storm cost over £520 million. The cost of repairing roads and bridges was around £120 million. £4 million was spent on restoring paths and trails, and there's probably still some damage that's not yet been repaired since 2015. But then there's also the less obvious or indirect economic and social impacts, the impact on health and well-being, which has a knock-on effect on health service and workplace productivity. There's community access to services, which can be inhibited in places that are already isolated and struggling to access services. There's the impact from extreme weather events on tourism businesses, the loss of business, the loss of jobs. There's also the environmental cost of stripping out homes post-flooding and the huge amount of non-recycled waste that can arise as a result of that. There's loss of topsoil, which damages land, and also the water bodies that it washes into. There's loss of habitat and impact on wildlife. Storm Arwen meant thousands of trees in Cumbria were lost. And then on top of that, there's the cost of adapting to climate change. So the adaptation of homes, the adaptation of roads and bridges, the building of flood defences. So in Kendal at the moment, £76 million is being spent on building walls along the River Kent. So we know very well in Cumbria the high price of climate change from that kind of cost perspective. But there is also increasing recognition that climate economics isn't just about the costs, it's also about the opportunities, the benefits, and making more systemic changes to the way we live. So it involves making markets work better for people and planet. It involves renewable energy generation, minimizing waste, more efficient use of materials, reusing and recycling products. So the promotion of a circular economy. It provides opportunities for new production processes that are low or zero carbon, for example, for steel manufacture. It involves the sharing of resources potentially between businesses, where perhaps the waste heat from one business might help power another business. It is an opportunity for new collaborations between individuals, private firms, research institutes, local authorities and regulators. It's an opportunity for employment, good sustainable jobs. It's an opportunity to address inequalities. There's also opportunity for carbon sequestration of the irreducible carbon emissions. And it's about socially responsible investment and the multiple benefits to be gained from taking action on climate change. So as we hear from our presenters today, it's also perhaps worth having in mind some of the particulars of Cumbria. It's a very rural county. So 75% of the county is classified as rural versus the national average of around 25%. We have a falling and aging population. We have lots and lots of very small businesses. So 99% of businesses have less than 250 employees. 89% of businesses employ fewer than 10 people. It's harder to get around Cumbria by public transport. So car ownership is higher than the national average. We've got 13% more empty homes than the national average, presumably due to second home ownership, holiday homes. We've got youth unemployment, which is 5 times the national average in some areas. We've got 1 in 8 households of income of less than 10 grand per year. We have got twice the national average of homes with oil-fired heating, and we've got twice the national average of homes with no heating at all. We also have 1 in 10 households in fuel poverty. That's the highest anywhere in the country. And that will obviously get worse as energy prices continue to rise. That's a combination of low income and the traditional hard to heat stone-built homes that we have. So those are some of the sort of economic challenges that we have in Cumbria. But we also have lots of opportunities to make a positive difference to people's lives as we transition from high to low carbon living and working. We've got lots of natural assets for renewable energy generation and carbon sequestration. We've got lots of motivation to take action because we know the impacts of extreme weather events. We have a growing network of community sustainability organisations and growing demand for action from the population. We have the Zero Carbon Cumbria Partnership, and we have an opportunity through the local government reorganisation to fully integrate green economic approaches into the new unitary authorities, which will be emerging post-elections in May, ready for launch in 2023. And also we've got events like this to hear ideas and hopefully to make some new connections. So I'm just going to stop share and hand on now to Kira Shannon from the Green Investment Initiative, who's going to talk to us about galvanising green investment for Cumbria for about 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. I recognise quite a few of you, so forgive me if you've heard bits of my presentation before now. I'm just going to share my screen. So what do I do? 1 second, yes. So last year we were very fortunate in terms of being able to get funded from Quadrature Climate Foundation and also having the support from Cumbria Action for Sustainability. And our initiative, the Green Investment Plan Cumbria, set up really in response to what are the alternatives to that coal mine over there in West Cumbria. And we came up with a report with 15 sort of headline ideas, a mixture of ideas, but also finance mechanisms. Probably 8 of them were all around sort of community well-being, but also community ownership. So I will go into some of those ideas within this report. But I think really we need to start off with, you know, this sort of horrifying rise in energy prices right now, and then sort of today's headline that 4 in 10 people could fall into energy poverty. I mean, that is really very, very serious. Everyone's finger seems to point to Rishi Sunak, but also what can the financial sector be doing? How can they be rising to this challenge or harnessing the public good? We also had a couple of weeks ago the energy security strategy, mixed responses to that. But I think really importantly, in addition to finance, is the way that climate policies will be sort of mobilizing, you know, the pace of change here and wealth creation. Probably 4 or 5 months ago was the levelling up agenda. I had to read 50 pages before I came across the word net zero. And this seems sort of a disconnect between the importance of levelling up and also the opportunities of net zero. But also I'd like to bring that straight down to Cumbria and where Cumbria is heading in terms of this exciting two unitary authorities. And I think that actually there's going to be quite a levelling up between Cumberland and Westmoreland and Furness. But also conversely, I think there's probably more opportunities in Cumberland / West Cumbria, particularly on the decarbonisation side of things. So I think Cumbria really needs to, in this context of finance well-being, needs to be thinking of really cementing levelling up and net zero. So to start off with definitions, this is obviously about net zero economics. I love the fact that economics comes from 2 Greek words, eco, home, and nomos, accounts. But generally it means production, consumption, distribution. As you all know, main measurement, GDP. Cumbria doesn't measure GDP. It has a gross value add, GVA, which is 12 billion, which on its own sounds quite impressive. But actually it's not that impressive, which I will go on to talk about. But the economy, as we all know, it touches every aspect of our lives. So then net zero economics is how do we boost that productivity? And that will be in the investments or a focus on the net zero technologies. Karen mentioned some of them, natural capital assets. And this is across the value chain. So left, right, up and down, whichever way that we need to go. When we're talking about green finance or sustainable finance, many people interchange those 2 things. Sustainable includes particularly the social side of things. So the ESG or the S of the environmental, social and governance in the investment world. But we do need around 50 billion a year. And that's probably a conservative estimate, but that comes from the Climate Change Committee. There's no way that public budgets can finance this. So this is why you need this private sector capital. But interestingly, the net zero strategy has said that all of the UK emissions, 82% of those fall within the scope of the local authorities. So this really underscores the importance of local investments or what local authorities can do to facilitate this green finance going forward. The exciting thing is that there is lots of money, but the problem is that the funding isn't actually being, it's not flowing in the correct way. Sorry to be switching around. And one of the reasons why it's not flowing in the correct way is that the projects aren't investor ready. There needs to be more projects that have got very solid business plans, as well as the project owners and developers having a good understanding on what project finance is, what blended finance is, And so we believe, the Green Investment Plan Cumbria believes that there is a big opportunity to create project-ready, investor-ready projects here in Cumbria. And so one thing that we believe needs to happen is to identify low-carbon projects and then bring them together with private financiers, and then work out the commercial structure. Now, why isn't the LEP doing this? Well, absolutely, the LEP is doing this, but I think there is also the opportunity to really be focusing on the the smaller, the SMEs, the private sector side that the LEP perhaps isn't doing. So going back to Cumbria, well, I was surprised to read that Cumbria's productivity is actually 19% lower than the UK average, and it's actually 10 to 12% lower than the Northwest. So productivity in this is the output of labour. So the way that Cumbria is measuring its productivity is its labour output. It has a tight, limited and falling labour pool. But what it does have, which is very positive, is these diverse business sectors. And, you know, we do excel in wood and paper production, nuclear, maritime engineering, etc. In the water sector, we do have quite a high labour productivity. But on this chart on the right, we've got low labour productivity in construction, agriculture and forestry. So why is this relevant to net zero? Because I think that what each county needs to do, and what Cumberland and Westmoreland will need to do, is to really understand what are its strengths and what are its weaknesses. So I mentioned that concept of the value chain. So it's really thinking ahead in terms of, well, this is where we can really increase the productivity. So Karen mentioned the 1% of the GDP to start off with in terms of the investment costs. So if Cumbria's GVA is 11 billion, that means Cumbria will need around 110 million pounds of every year. So what are the areas for improvement? Well, rates of innovation. So that's another really exciting game changer for Cumbria, is the innovation. The higher levels of skills, so that really goes down to sort of all the education and further education, and also the export opportunities, all important for Cumbria. So going back to the Green Investment Plan Cumbria, just to sort of say what we've done. So we had 4 sector roundtables last year. We had a report launch. We also, we've developed key ideas. Our report's been downloaded a huge number of times, which is great, but also internationally. And what we hope to do is to really build this year, once we get the financing, on the community wealth proposals. So what are they? So one of them is CLES, which would be an offshore wind project. And there is an offshore wind proposal in Scotland, but so far not in the UK. So for offshore in particular, this would be the first offshore wind community-owned project in England. We also want to look at nature ideas and come up with a warehousing idea, which would include having basically a pot of carbon credits, but they could be community owned, and these would be financing for woodland, peatland, etc. We've also considered a retrofit hub, and this could be led by a community benefit society. We've given ideas already around the Cumbrian coastal community forest, and within our report that we've basically increased the acreage to some 7,000 acres. So really at the heart of what we're planning to do is we want to accelerate green finance locally. And to do this, we would set up a community interest company, and we would make sure that a percentage of the projects will ensure that there is a local interest within the investment or who the investors are. I'm just going to really move to the last slide here, which is about CLES, because in fact, there's already progress on CLES. And we are calling the community offshore wind farm CLES, well, mainly because it gives it some sort of identity, but we are taking the word there from collective. And Arup are leading on this, so they are an engineering company. And the idea is that there would be a 1.2 gigawatt community-owned offshore wind farm off the coast around opposite of St. Bees. We think it would cost around 3 billion. It would be around for about 27 years. And it would supply renewable energy to Whitehaven and Sellafield, potentially all of Cumbria. But the offshore wind farm would also feed into some other potential green hydrogen projects, which would be based in Carlisle, Workington and Whitehaven. So where we're at with that is that we are teaming up with a project developer and Arup and others. So quite a lot of people are interested in this idea. But what needs to happen first is to get initial funding. So BEIS actually has some green hydrogen funding, competition funding, and there is an opportunity to bid for that funding at the end of this month. But it would take around 6 months or so. So once we've got the initial funding to then develop this idea, we would then move into the phase of working out the community ownership. Some of you would have been following the great progress around the Ripple Energy Kirkhill 8 onshore wind farm project. And you know, full credit goes to Ripple in terms of the way that they really thought about the sort of the ownership structure there for the community. So we would be looking at that. So that's really some of our projects. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kira. We've got a few minutes now for some questions, if you're okay with that, Kira. I'm just looking at what's coming up in the chat. We have a comment from Diane Jones about the process to access funding being too competitive without adequate notice being given to create projects and deliver those in time, and that we do need to bring private sector on board. And that's more of a comment. Oh, could you please explain labour output a little more?
Is that the question you want me to go with?
If you can.
Oh, Kira, the economist, not. Well, I mean, labour output is a very standard form of productivity, and it's basically based on, I think, working hours, and also it's mixed in with wage, I think. So if there are any economists in the room, please prove me wrong. But I was quite interested because I listened to a very good presentation led by someone at the LEP who was surprised, or not surprised, but that Cumbria only mentions labour productivity. It's not looking at other indicators. So I think that there's a lot of information about Cumbria that's just not in the public realm.
There's a comment from Steve Curl about Cumbria LEP's key focus being on supporting Cumbria SMEs as well as the zero carbon energy supplies. Comment from Henry Goodwin about not hearing anything about alternative economics, just more market-driven economics that have brought us to this mess we are in. We are just at the beginning of this event. I hope, Henry, that we'll also hear about some alternatives. I don't know, Kira, whether you want to
yes,
come back on that at all.
Well, no, I didn't want to ruin Antonia's thunder, and I'm very interested in hearing more about their community wealth, and also to sort of talk a bit about the New Economics Foundation. They've been looking at alternatives to GDP since sort of 2014. There are so many, I think Karen actually mentioned them, but particularly excited to listen to what Antonia has to say later. So I basically stay clear of it.
Question from Helen Atewell: are any of the local authorities or the LEP engaged in constructing a green energy, green skills and jobs bid for the new UK government shared prosperity fund? Surely this is an opportunity to support the ZCC vision. I'll open that up actually, if anybody from the LEP could comment on that, or from local authority. I'm looking for hands up, if you could raise your virtual hand rather than your real hand. I'm not seeing any hands raised. So is there a gap there and an action that we need to take? Oh, Chris.
Yeah, hi, Chris Natras here from Lakes College. Just a quick response to that. Yes is the short answer. I'm speaking on behalf of the college sector here, but we've been building plans in anticipation of this fund to develop exactly what the questioner put forward, which is green skills, low carbon skills, a hub and spoke model probably in Cumbria that links in with the local authorities and the LEP to develop a skills pipeline for green technology, green jobs. So yes, that is in the pipeline, and I think the Prosperity Fund has just been launched, hasn't it? Just last week. So we're building plans as quickly as we can. Brilliant.
Thank you for that, Chris. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat, so let's move on then and hear from Antonia Jennings from the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, who's going to talk to us about developing progressive economics for people, planet and place, for about 10 minutes, and then that will give us about 5 minutes of Q&A.
Right, thanks, Karen. I'm just going to start by sharing my screen. Can you all see that? Yes, fab. So yeah, firstly, just to say thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks to previous speakers for their fantastic contributions. So as Karen said, I'm going to talk today about how CLES uses an approach to economics that we call community wealth building to both address COVID recovery and reform efforts, but also to tackle the climate and wider environmental emergency. So before I do that, just to tell you a little bit about CLES. So as mentioned, I'm one of 4 associate directors. We come and talk at events like this and articulate what CLES's view on local economic policy and practice is. CLES is the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, as I mentioned, and we say that we're the national organisation for local economies. And we're really committed to realising progressive economics for people, place and the planet. We've got a strong commitment to places and communities all across the UK who are experiencing social and economic inequality and lack of opportunity. And ultimately, our fundamental aim is to achieve social justice, good local economies and effective public services. So I just wanted to say a little bit about the moment that we find ourselves in, that being COVID. So obviously this is a very major public and economic event of historical importance, potentially unprecedented in its magnitude in peacetime. And the effects on our social, economic and political future are inevitably going to be profound and long-lasting. In the main, over the past couple of years, we've seen demand for goods and services fluctuate all over the place, but on the whole, really go down with horrific consequences for jobs and business. And it's important to say that our operating context prior to COVID was already affected by long-standing social and economic crises. So we can say, I think, with confidence that our economic model, current economic model pre-COVID, was already failing. In the last year, the latest Joseph Rowntree Foundation report that comes out every year shows that 14 million people are now living in poverty. That's more than 1 in 5 of us, and tragically that includes 4 million children and 2 million pensioners. And as the previous speaker mentioned, with the cost of living crisis, we're set to see that increase dramatically. We've also seen alongside that 0-hour contracts have reached a record high, and almost 1 million people have no guaranteed work from 1 week to the next. And alongside that, we've seen the Marmot Review come out, and it's revealed a stalling life expectancy for the first time in a century. And the conclusion that Marmot himself drew in that report was that it was austerity that is responsible for life expectancy flatlining, people's health deteriorating, and the widening of health inequalities. So, and then COVID-19 came. So I think it's fair to say that what COVID-19 has done is it's essentially exacerbated pre-existing cracks and fault lines in our economy. And we are still obviously seeing how the effects of this global pandemic are going to unfold, but we are seeing the consequences of a state that's become too lean and too mean being played out in horrific real time. So alongside a public health crisis, we are also having parallel economic and social crises. And we know that the ensuing unemployment, the ensuing poverty is going to make the nation sicker, heaping yet more burden onto already cut public services. So what's been the impact? So obviously from national government, we've seen a suite of new interventionist policies, and they've been pretty much across the board politically welcome, but they are struggling to play catch up with years of neglect. We've seen, of course, the health service struggling to cope, but we've seen upwards of 30,000 people die in care homes. We've seen millions furloughed and not finding work after the furlough scheme was rolled back. We've seen a tenfold increase at some points in the pandemic in universal credit claims. And of course, we're seeing many more people falling into debt arrears, into poverty, heaping yet more misery and more suffering on people that have already found themselves over the last 10, 15 years in a desperate situation. So I think it's fair to say that COVID has caught this country pretty underprepared, and it's really revealed the distressed state of our local economies, the condition of the public sector, and other kind of social issues. So looking ahead, at CLES, we're kind of hazarding a guess at 3 broad scenarios as potential outcomes of the economic crisis, sort of depending on the actions that we now take. I've caricatured these 3 scenarios as the good, the bad, and the ugly. So the bad, to start with that, unfortunately, our current political economic paradigm means that the most likely scenario politicians are going to aim at is the bad, which is essentially trying to get back to what we had before. Unfortunately, that's not the worst that could happen. There's also the ugly. The ugly may look like a full-on shock doctrine disaster response, combining new state authoritarianism and also an exploitation of new laws introduced through the crisis with ongoing uncontrolled corporate capitalism. And we're already seeing some of this happen. We're seeing, for example, hedge funds marshalling up the resources to buy up failing businesses on the cheap. There is the good, and in this scenario, there's a broad understanding that the present crisis is our last best opportunity to change course and to build a more local, a more generative, a more social, and a more democratic economic system. And under that system, all things would be seen as possible. So potentially universal basic income, or universal basic services, through to a truly green economy, and potentially a new era of democratic economic planning. So to really bring about the good, we do need action from a national policy perspective. However, at the local level, there's a great deal that can be achieved regardless of the national policy perspective. And I would also say as well that by trialling new interventions on a local level, we're building up an evidence base for what can work on a national level. So what does this good look like? So first and foremost, this should be about building an inclusive economy. So this is what localities should be aiming at. And for us, that means an economy which is focused on social goals, environmental sustainability, social justice, and prosperity for all. And fundamental to that idea, I think, is the need to decouple the idea that economic success is contingent on growth. And we need to realise that continual growth is impossible on a finite planet with finite resources. Crucially, of course, this is going to require abandoning GDP, which is gross domestic product, as the leading indicator of economic health, and instead to adopt a broader set of metrics. in terms of what that might be, we could consider setting similar objectives to those contained within the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which was recently passed by the Welsh Assembly. And they measure success of public policy in terms of action against poverty, reduction in health inequality, and action on climate change. And so we would say that this should really be the fundamental aim of any local economic strategy. We're seeing this already across the country. Particularly, I'm sat here in London, next door to a borough called Newham. And Newham recently have put livelihood, wellbeing and happiness as the key tenets of economic success, so not growth. So in terms of the how, around how we do this, we advocate for something that we call community wealth building. And what that is it's a people-centred approach to local economic development that aims to reorganise local economies so that wealth isn't extracted out of it, but redirected back into the local economy. And really central to that intention is that we minimise the market share of large national or international businesses which focus on maximising profits to distant shareholders. And instead, we substitute that with the promotion of locally productive forms of business. So at CLES, we call them generative businesses. And essentially, they're firms in which wealth is shared broadly between both the owners of the business, but also the workers and the consumers, allowing wealth to flow through to local people and local places. So in practice, this means businesses like SMEs, cooperatives, community interest companies, social enterprises, etc., being allowed to flourish. And there's a really important role for local government here in terms of setting the strategy. And that's a strategy which encourages more generative businesses in the local economy. So I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about our work with regards to community wealth building and the road to net zero. The two main areas we've focused on so far, there's a slide here about, just quickly, sorry, there's a slide here about the 5 key principles of community wealth building. So these aren't mutually exclusive, but as you can see on the screen, they work together to ultimately promote more inclusive ownership. So there's a financial pillar, we call them pillars, there's something on workforce, there's spending or procurement pillar, and also land and property. So as I said, the most of our work on the energy transition has focused on energy efficiency and energy generation. And I think the really exciting thing about the road to net zero and community wealth building is up until pretty much this point, community wealth building has looked at what's already going on within a local economy and tried to retrofit a community wealth building lens to it. With the energy transition, with the road to net zero, we're going to be seeing huge new markets open up, and we have the opportunity at their conception to put a community wealth building lens through them. So essentially, it should be an easier job if we lay the right foundations now. I'm slightly aware I've already run over time, so I'm going to go as fast as I can. But just to say that we're going to I'm going to focus on energy efficiency and energy generation. The 3 principles have really underpinned all of our work in this area, as you can see on screen, is firstly that the local is innately critical to tackle climate change. The route to net zero looks very different in Cumbria to Hackney to the Outer Hebrides. Second sort of principle is that we need to ensure that investment benefits our people and our places. And then finally, we need community buy-in for the transition to succeed. So just on the energy transition, we've recently produced a toolkit around how we do the energy transition with a community wealth building lens. This has come off the back of a very long project engaging with 12 local authority referencing partners. The toolkit includes 3 deep dive cases, and the toolkit also as a whole explores the enablers and barriers to community wealth building approaches in energy generation and also energy efficiency and decarbonising energy infrastructure more broadly. So on energy generation, firstly, I'm going to whip through this and do energy efficiency and then wrap up. But essentially, we know that enabling alternative models of ownership to the, within this agenda is key to its success. We know that community renewables retain 7 times more value in the local economy than commercial models. We also know that community renewables receive strong levels of support from local people, and they reduce opposition to the initiatives through participation and fairer distribution of economic benefits. And we also know within this that there are huge opportunities for municipal energy generation. So in terms of what those opportunities actually look like in terms of practical interventions, we know that there's a huge opportunity around using spare or underdeveloped land and property, roofs, but also the land more broadly, as space for community renewables. We know that there's a huge opportunity to utilise staff resource to support energy projects establishing. We know that procuring energy from local community energy groups through installation on council property, and the list goes on, as you can see on the screen, that there's, again, an opportunity. We talked about the need for finance. There is the need for private finance, but there's also untapped financial potential with regards to community share offers, and we've seen them explode across the country as well. And we also know that key to this agenda is work with relevant local bodies to deliver support for groups seeking to build community renewables. So I'm happy to share slides afterwards, but I'm going to skip this slide. When it comes to energy efficiency, we know that the UK both has a particular problem with energy efficiency, but also a huge opportunity. We have some of the most, the least well insulated housing stock and the oldest housing stock in Europe. We also know fuel poverty is at a record high, and we know that estimates around cost of living crisis are going to push as many as 1 million extra people into fuel poverty over the next year. We also know that we lack the supply chains to deliver retrofit. And we know that retrofit activity has to benefit local businesses and deliver for fuel poor households. Again, so similar to energy generation, with regards to energy efficiency, there's an opportunity to retrofit publicly owned stock, and that can also be used to build up the local supplier base. We know that in many localities, local construction firms are struggling, and there's again an opportunity to upskill that local workforce to meet the skills needed for high quality retrofits. There's an opportunity around innovating through finance and building community wealth through government funding, and also for anchor institutions, as we call them at CLES, which are essentially huge institutions, most often public, but not exclusively, that are rooted in a place. So, for example, a university, a council, even sort of a fire and rescue department. They have a huge opportunity to, I keep saying huge opportunity, but genuinely there are a lot of opportunities, but just working together, they can strengthen the local supply chain and also identify gaps in the market. And finally, we know that councils have a huge role in directing or redirecting business support towards SMEs, which could deliver retrofit. So again,
Antonia, are you able to wrap up?
Yeah, there we go. So more specifically, there's some enablers and barriers, and I will wrap up and leave it there.
That was brilliant. Gosh, what a journey you've taken us on. Fantastic. Thank you so much for all that information. I'm just quickly looking in the chat, and there's a question there about the Preston model. I wonder whether there is a link that you could put in the chat, Antonia, that would guide people to information about the Preston model, because I fear we're going to have to move on. There is a question from Kate Wilshaw about lots of potential for generating Kendal's electricity from the roofs, but where could funding come from to enable households and businesses to get solar panels? I mean, you've talked a little bit about that in your last few slides. Is there any kind of really obvious mechanism for getting investment in effectively kind of privately owned property?
Yeah, so essentially there is no obvious mechanism to do it. There's obviously the able to pay market, which is effectively homeowners that are concerned about energy efficiency and are happy to pay themselves. There are some grants available for the fuel poor, and then it's also obviously incumbent on these anchor institutions to start doing it themselves, and then potentially sell back excess electricity to the grid, potentially to subsidise local businesses in the area. But in terms of a funding pot that's directly for that at the moment, it unfortunately doesn't exist, as far as I'm aware. But please, if anyone does know of one, correct me.
We have got some more questions in the chat. I wonder, Antonia, whether you could perhaps answer in the chat whilst we move on. Sorry about that.
No, it's my fault for going over. Sorry.
No, it was great stuff. I wish we could have given you more time. So we're moving on now to hear from Matt Rooney from Anthesis, who's going to talk about authority-based insetting, which is a form of offsetting. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Karen. And yeah, very good afternoon, everyone. Really, really great to be here. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen. So I hope this goes right first time. Here we go. Let's see if that's beaming through. Looking for a nod from Karen. Can you see my screen there? Amazing. So yeah, really great actually to finish the follow the last two speakers. I think there's a ton of overlap, certainly in terms of blending public-private finance and looking to retain wealth locally. This is nicely placed. So yeah, authority-based insetting, or more affectionately referred to as ABBY, is something that me and my team have produced at Consultants Anthesis. So I lead a lot of the work we've been doing with local authorities up and down the country over the last few years, and something that has really come from a common need. So a lot of the councils you'll see listed at the bottom there have all in one way or another expressed a similar need that I'm gonna tell you more about. I'm going to do that in three main chunks. So the what, why, and how. So I'll get stuck straight into that now. So what is ABBY? So what are the objectives? So ultimately, it's to, as we've heard at the start, it's to make more projects happen. We're kind of woefully behind targets, and certainly locally, many authorities are recognising that they need to do more to make more projects happen. So this really is fundamental to what we're trying to do: get more projects off the ground, bring new sources of finance, and all with a local edge. A secondary objective is really around the reporting and impact measurement. Again, a common need that this is currently done quite badly. Certainly, many local authorities don't really know how to talk about the impact that they're having, and many citizens, businesses aren't too sure on how to hold their local authorities to account, because again, some of this information on impact isn't reported as effectively as we felt it could be. So they're the two overarching objectives. To then start explaining what it actually is then. So what have we done? We've looked at offsetting. I can confirm it's not offsetting. So offsetting, to clarify, is typically where projects, certainly when you think of certified offsetting projects, they tend to mainly happen in many developing countries, other side of the world. In the UK, there's a couple of certified schemes, but typically there are a very few projects. And thinking of Cumbria, there might be a bit of wetland, peatland restoration. There might be some tree planting projects, but very limited in their supply. And certainly when you look nationally across local authorities, many don't have any certified options in their borough. So ABBY is not offsetting. It's not traditional insetting, so maybe slightly less well known to many of you, but insetting, it's been an emerging concept where many typically corporates look to invest a lot sort of less formally in their supply chain, so more done through mutual agreement to work for mutual benefit with their suppliers. So for example, a company might choose to invest in energy saving technology in their supply chain with a view to help their supplier save money, to then pass it on to them. Similarly, there's examples that you might find going back to sort of farmlands, and again, companies working with their suppliers and farmers to make their land more productive or resilient to climate change. So it's not that would be just sort of corporate insetting in its own right, but what it is, it's borrowing certain principles from both. So what it is putting a geographical sort of boundary around the local authority borough, and focusing on carbon saving projects that take place within the borough. And in terms of sort of borrowing some of the principles, so as I'll come on to, we're exploring how carbon sort of projects and shares of saving could be sold as a means of raising finance, but also looking at the mutual benefits involved, as we've just heard, I think in all previous presentations, as I'm sure you know, the co-benefits that go with many of these carbon saving projects will stand to benefit the local authority. So looking at how those benefits can be retained and enjoyed by the local borough. So again, just to clarify what authority-based setting sets out to deliver and what it doesn't, it's not intended as a accounting trick that on paper allows councils or organisations to do one thing and say another. This is very much about, as I said at the start, making projects happen. So irrespective, I guess, of the sort of project level reporting, the outcome of this should be to drag that blue line that represents the borough emissions. It should be to drag that downwards and reduce emissions. So yeah, I guess just to sort of put that beyond doubt, it's very much intended to bring emissions down in their kind of purest sense when you look at this at a borough level. So then what did we do in terms of this concept? To give you a bit more context there, so as I said, we've been working with authorities, and last year we managed to get some crowdfunding to identify what are the key ingredients that would be needed to drive the outcomes I talked about around more projects, better collaboration between public, private sort of funding, and better reporting. So we got some money to go and investigate, and we produced a framework document that broke it down into 3 main areas. And again, we've heard bits of these previously, but just to kind of play these back in a slightly different way. Firstly, you can't really do a lot unless you've identified the projects. And so a big part of this is to help local authorities make meaningful and set up meaningful partnerships like the one I'm speaking at today, with loads of really great actors that can actually put forward projects and actually have something tangible to work on and collaborate on. So a ton of guidance on some of the key sort of success factors there. Middle bit is around the funding. So where can the funding come from? So again, exploring 2 sides to it really. What funding streams does a council already have access to that they could direct to carbon saving projects? So things such as Section 106 money, community infrastructure levy, procurement, and sort of leveraging procurement contracts to invest in carbon saving projects locally. But of course then the private sector side to it, which again, there could be a ton of opportunities there, whether it's at the more sort of philanthropic donation CSR sort of end, where again, a load of this is already happening, and many of the companies that are investing in their communities are all expressing that they wish they could measure the impact better. So you've got that at one end of the spectrum versus the kind of I guess mini market, if you like, that are currently investing in offsets. And actually could there be an alternative that might better align with the impact that they're trying to drive, and sort of act as a substitute or alternative to current offsetting activities. So it's a ton of stuff considered in that middle bucket. And the final area is okay, how to report this, and as I said, hit that objective of credible, consistent reporting. So we've developed a mechanism that leans a lot on existing guidance that's out there and sort of tries to simplify and tailor it and help it be more easily applied by a local authority user. But also it can allow more transparency around when you do have multiple investors, such as public, private investors, to try and fairly reflect the contribution, because again, that can sometimes serve as a barrier in terms of who gets the credit. We're trying to break and just give more transparency, so that's not an issue, and that anyone that is contributing, where there are multiple stakeholders, can come out of it feeling like they've got a way that fairly reflects their support. So why is this important? Again, we've heard a few of these reasons, so forgive me if I am repeating some of this, but actually the first reason will be a bit newer. So there currently is a lack, as I said, of certified offsetting options. And now, while I completely get the fact that offsetting should be a last resort, it should be for the hard to get out emissions, the reality is that many councils have set a very, very ambitious target. So we're seeing targets of 2025, 2030. And the reality is that there is a performance gap, and those authorities currently cannot invest in offsets because it's not politically viable to do so. So even if they wanted to try and offset it, irrespective of effort invested, they're being told by their elected members that we can't send money outside of the borough. This is taxpayer money that has to stay in the borough. We need an alternative place for this investment to go. So lack of availability of certified offsetting options, or certainly sufficient quantity. We've heard from many of our partners about the appetite from the private sector, really encouraging, where many of our partners last year had been approached by companies saying, we want to give you our money for low carbon causes, take our money to invest. And of course the councils, in many cases, can't, because there's no system to do that. So we're getting some really positive noises from the private sector. I've talked about impact measurement, probably not a lot else to say there, other than, again, as a minimum, this should be doable, that we can help organisations communicate their local impact better. I think more at the best case end, there could be, as I said, that range from giving a return, a carbon payback return on investment, where rather than it just being a community investment that goes out the door, we want to be able to incentivize more investment by giving businesses that visibility on what the impact was from a carbon perspective. And more generally, I think a mechanism like this we do see as quite innovative. There's been a lot of attempts to do this, and we feel that we are on to something quite new and exciting by taking very much a sort of carbon first, or primary driver carbon approach to this. And we do think it could inspire some new innovation and some new ways of bringing more funding to projects. So how could it be relevant? So final bit really is knowing that there's a mixture of local authorities and private sector, third sector in the room here. I think there's a couple of angles that could be relevant. So project identification, we are currently trying to really build up a big sort of database or repository of projects, where it could basically serve as an outlet to give organisations help. So if you've got a ton of projects, as many corporates that we spoke to have, but they simply don't quite make the payback threshold or the internal return on investment threshold, we want to offer a place to advertise that. And so whether that then attracts help from the council themselves, or it can help us matchmake help from other sources, there's a big sort of piece here on actually just building up that pipeline of projects and advertising that. Then I guess on the other side of that, there could be many of those organisations, as I said, that are already wanting to invest, or it could be a technology provider, or it could be a financial institution. We know, and we've heard already, that there is money available, and so a big part of this is to direct some of that project sponsorship to the projects themselves. And the final bit is actually thinking about the governance for all this, because again, we're starting to see some really interesting examples now where authorities are setting up local environment funds, or they're looking to embed better carbon accountability in existing funds or existing partnerships. So there's a whole range of scenarios there to understand how this could fit and how it could be integrated. And it sounds already like it could complement a few of the things going on in Cumbria. And yeah, I think that then leads really to what we're doing this year. So we've managed to kind of crowd fund a phase 2. So there were a lot of questions that we came away with from phase 1 that we want to go away and answer. Two main parts to it really. One is starting to scale up that list of projects, so enhancing visibility of local projects. So again, a few hoops to jump through there, where we might need to engage with partnerships, we might need to engage one-on-one with larger businesses or larger employers, but we really need to test the concept with the private sector. And then the second part is to look at some of the more generic questions around, okay, what does a transaction look like if we were to bring a public and a private partner together? What's the agreement? How do we share the carbon? How do we implement the safeguards? How do we report it in a way that is fair and transparent? So there's a few sort of residual questions there that we're looking to answer for the greater good of all our partners. I think the final bit to mention here really is that there's still opportunity to get involved. So we only just kicked this off. We've got, including a CA, we'll have over 30 local authorities taking part this year, and they seem to certainly value that comfort in consensus going at it together. So still plenty of opportunity if this does sound of interest. And just to end, I managed to, someone sent me a link to a really nice example from down in Surrey. So it's not a carbon saving scheme, it's a community project scheme, but I think actually it lends quite a lot of inspiration for Abbey and how they've got a sort of idea sharing board overlaid on a map. And when you drill down into the map, you can click on certain ideas, and you can see there's a cost required for investment. So again, some parallels there with where we want to get to for Abbey. There's a mention of co-benefits, and there's obviously some detail. And so I think, you know, to maybe bring this to life a bit, I could easily see something similar for Abbey, where you obviously just have some sharper carbon saving figures there. And again, our method proposes a way to do that in quite a pragmatic way. So for those struggling to sort of visualize how this could look, I think this example here for Surrey certainly has helped a few people I've talked to.
That's great.
But that's it. Yeah, thanks for your time, and yeah, happy to take any questions.
Just time for a quick question from Alex Downs in the chat, asking, did you design the guidance for all local authorities across the UK? Or did you consider the differences between rural and urban areas in terms of size of local authority, project types, and scale of private investment available?
Sure, yeah, thanks for the question. And yes, we had all sorts in our phase one. So yeah, districts, unitaries, CAs, and met boroughs, and yeah, of all shapes, sizes, and different degrees of how rural they were. So on the link that's currently on screen, you'll be able to download a list of example projects. We made sure that we got in a nature-based, or a couple of nature-based. We had peatland, tree planting, but then really importantly, we had other sectors as well. So it is also sort of retrofit of domestic transport. So one of the really key things is that it does cover all sectors, and currently we're still figuring out if there are certain projects that work better with it, but at the moment it's pretty wide open in terms of if we can prove and demonstrate it saves carbon overall, then we're really keen to try and include it.